I will not have an interpreter, so I will try to speak slowly, which is hard for me because I speak fast. If I start speaking faster, just raise your hand, and that will remind me to slow down, okay? You're in charge of that, because I get faster and faster and faster. Yes, and go like this, okay. And I will not be speaking in Siswanti. I'm still learning. I'm actually from Canada, and I lived in Canada my whole life. I went to school in America, and like many of you students, my goal was to be successful. Does anyone here want to be successful? Yes. Except I wasn't smart enough to go to medical school. I wanted to be in business. Business is easier than medical. And I decided that I wanted to be rich. Anyone here want to be rich? That was my goal. I wanted to be rich. I wanted to have a nice car. I wanted to have nice holidays. And so I worked hard towards that. And when I was very young, when I was 21, I started in marketing. And by the time I was 24, I had started my own marketing company, selling mostly marketing to consumer products. You've heard of Coca-Cola? Yes? You've heard of Disney? Kellogg's? All of those clients I had as my clients in my company. By the time I was 30 years old, I had the largest marketing agency in Canada, and one of the only women in the world to own a marketing business. And I had my big house, and I had my nice car, and I had my nice family, and I had my nice holidays. And there may be some Christians here. I was a Christian, so I could say I believe in Jesus and I went to church on Sundays. But my life wasn't complete. My business was my first priority, and then my family was my next priority, and then my faith was below that. On September 11th, 2001, do you all remember where you were? Do you remember what happened? America was attacked. Remember, the planes crashed into the buildings in New York City. Well, I was in New York City that day. I was there at a conference. And the planes were crashing into buildings. My husband was on an airplane from Canada to Chicago. So I'm in New York City, and I know that America's under attack. I know my husband's on an airplane, and my children are small, and they're back in Canada. And it was a terrible day. It was a day that changed the whole world. Everyone was affected that day. And my life turned upside down that day. Because I didn't know if I was going to live. I didn't know if my husband, if his plane was going to crash. I didn't know if I'd see my children again. And when you go through something like that, many people go through tragedies in life. They don't have to be a tragedy like that, but we go through things in our lives, death. We're from all over the world here. And it can cause you to stop and evaluate your life and say, what am I doing? I had owned my company for 16 years at that point. And what am I doing with my life? Have I achieved what I'm supposed to achieve? I could say, yes, I have the nice house, I have the nice car, I have the family, I have nice holidays. But as a Christian, I had to think, is that really, really what I'm supposed to be doing? Has God given me all of these things and all of this influence just for me? And I knew the answer was no. But I didn't know what I was supposed to do. Because what I knew was marketing. I knew how to sell product. I knew how to get you to buy something that I want you to buy. I was good at it. I was really good. But I started sort of searching for what am I supposed to do with my life. And I had a friend who was going to Africa. And Africa Africa seemed like so far, well, Africa is far away. It's far away from Taiwan, it's far away from Canada. And I had a friend who was going, and I said, I should go with you, because maybe I'll find the meaning of life there. And I ended up in a country called Zambia. Now, how many people know that Africa is not a country? Okay, good. Many times when I speak, people think Africa is a country. It's not. It's 54 countries. Africa is a continent. It would be like saying Asia is a country. It's like saying, why isn't the government of Asia helping? It doesn't make sense, does it? Africa is a continent. In fact, it's a really, really big continent. And this is an example, shows you how many times, for example, the United States would fit into Africa 3 times. That's how big Africa is. This is China. Here. That's how big Africa is. Japan would fit in just here. It's a big, big, big continent. So to fly, so that the equator, the equator runs sort of through here, and to fly from there down to here is about 4.5 hours on a plane. To fly from the bottom to the top is a 12-hour flight. It's a big, big, big place. So my first trip to Africa, I landed somewhere in here. It wasn't China, it was Zambia. And I didn't know anything about where I was going. But the first night I was there, it's a very long story, I'll make it very short. My life changed because I met young children who were 5 years old, 6 years old, 10 years old, and they lived on the street. There was a pile of garbage on the street that night, my first night in Africa, and it looked like just street garbage. The people had thrown their trash. But when I looked closer, I saw that they were children. And they were children wrapped up in garbage. And many of them were sound asleep because they had taken drugs. They take glue and gasoline, just a bottle of water. And they put gasoline and glue in a bottle like this, and they go, and they inhale it. And it helps them to forget. It helps them to not know the pain of what's going on around them. And these 6-year-old, 5-year-old children, some of them had been on the street for 2 years. And every night, these young ones would be raped by the older ones. Every night. Every day, these young ones would have to climb into the garbage bins to pull out the garbage for the older ones to eat. Every night. And so, my first night in Africa, I decided that I would fix the problem because I was very arrogant. And I thought, this is terrible. Someone should do something. You know, why isn't anyone doing something about these children? So on my first night in Africa, I explained to my African host, my Zambian host, that I will go back home, and I know my African friends can laugh at me because you know people who do this. I'm going to go home and I'm going to raise money, and I'm going to build a home for these children, and we'll save all of these children. Good for me, because I'm so smart. And my African friends were so gracious and explained to me that just in that city, in Lusaka, Zambia, in one small country, there were 75,000 children living on the streets that night, and every night. Well, that was a bigger problem than I could solve. From there, I went to Kenya, which is on the coast, over here. And I spent a week in Kenya, and just in one city in Kenya, in Nairobi, there are 500,000, so 500,000 children living on the street every day. And every day eating out of garbage cans. And every day being raped. And every day being beaten by the police. Every day. And I went home, and then before I went home, I went to an orphanage where they had hundreds of children, and I spent the next 6 days talking to young girls, 12 years old, 13 years old, 14 years old. And their story was the same. They would say, when I was this age, my mother got sick, and my father got sick. And they were speaking of HIV/AIDS, but they didn't say that. They just said they got sick. They didn't know what their parents were sick from. And my father started to get very skinny, and he lost weight, and he had diarrhea all the time. And he couldn't eat. And then he died. And then I had to care for my mother. Every girl told me the same story. I had to care for my mother, but she was very sick too, and she couldn't eat. She had sores on her mouth, she had sores on her face, she had oozing on her skin. The girls would say I had to walk 2 hours to get water and bring it back so I could bathe my mother, care for her, and then she died. And then I was left with 5 brothers and sisters, 6, 7, 8, many. And they were all young, and they all were crying because our father had died and our mother had died. And then they were hungry. And these young girls would say, every day they would cry because they wanted food. And my aunts were dead, my uncles were dead, many people in the family had died. And then they said, and I didn't know what to do. I tried to get help, and for a long time I might have got help here, or I had some work, but then I had to do other things. And these young girls looked in my eyes and would tell me that they, in order to feed their younger brothers and sisters, they would go down the road to the man, and a man would have sex with them and give them a loaf of bread, or give them some rice, or give them some maize. And they would bring the bread back, and they would feed their brothers and sisters, but it only lasted one day. And then the next day, what would they do? Or they would go to school because maybe their mother had paid school fees before she died. But when there was no more money for school fees, then the teacher would say, oh, you stay after school. You stay after school and do something for me back over here, I'll let you stay in school. And the girls would get sexually transmitted diseases. The girls might contract HIV/AIDS. Some of the girls would get pregnant. Young girls, 12, 13 years old, 14 years old. And I listened to these stories and I thought, how did I not know this was happening? I learned then, this was in 2003, that it was predicted that there were 11 million children who have been orphaned by AIDS in just the bottom half of Africa, just from the equator down. And it was predicted that by 2010, there would be 43 million AIDS orphans. Now, we've passed 2010, and no one has seen that kind of number. We haven't seen 43 million AIDS orphans. But I believe it's because many of them have died of hunger. There are many children starving today, and many of them dying of malnutrition. Statistics show us that every 3 seconds, so let's count together, we'll count 1, 2, 3, and we'll snap our fingers, okay? So 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Statistics show us that every 3 seconds, a child dies of hunger or malnutrition. That's 30,000 children every day. It's 11 million children a year. That's not malaria, it's not AIDS, it's not typhoid, it's not cholera, it's malnutrition and hunger. Or malnutrition and hunger, yeah. And this was all new to me. So I'm a business person in Kenya for my first trip, and I'm seeing these children, I'm hearing these stories. I went back home, I started doing research, and started learning more and more and more and more. And I wondered why no one was talking about it. Why, in my educated circle of friends in Canada, why is no one talking about HIV and AIDS? Why is no one talking about starving children? I didn't know. I didn't know. But now I know. And now I'm in Taiwan talking about it. And now I go to America and talk about it. And now I live in Swaziland and talk about it. Because if we don't start talking about it, we can't do anything about it. And I can't do anything alone. I can't fix anything. But I can do a little bit. And maybe together with Taipei Medical University, even when the students were there this summer, we can do a little bit. And little by little, man lai, we can work together. Slowly, slowly, we can work together and do something. So, I go back home after my first trip to Africa. My whole life is upside down. And I know that I know that I know that I am supposed to close my company, give up my business life, and go and help. And I don't even know where I'm going to help. I've never heard of Swaziland. I've only been to Kenya and Zambia. And I've been there to volunteer. I wasn't even volunteering. I was touring for 2 weeks. But I knew that my life's work was in Africa, somewhere. Well, we're going to jump forward through the story. If you want to know all the details, there's books outside. I've written 2 books on it. But now, I live in Swaziland full time. And I love it. I was saying to my Swazi friends that were hoping to gain citizenship. And Swaziland needs help. But I'm not in Swaziland to fix Swaziland. That's not my, it doesn't need to be fixed. We all need to work together. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Swaziland. Swaziland has a population of less than 1 million people. When I was there in 2005, that was when I first went and volunteered there, the population was over 1 million. It was maybe 1.2 million. And it's estimated now that it's less than 1 million people because of HIV and AIDS. HIV and AIDS is wiping out the world nation, well, the whole nation. It is the highest HIV rate in the world. 46%, of course, you're medical students and researchers. So we all know that that percentage, it can be looked at in many different ways. But if you go out into the rural communities in Swaziland, you will see the countryside is decimated. If you meet with medical professionals in some of the main centers, Matsaba, Manzini, where they're doing testing every single day, they will estimate 65% in those urban centers. But 90% of all Swazis live in the most rural communities. Half of the population are orphan and vulnerable children. So Swaziland is in a very unique, has a very unique society, whereas in Zambia or Kenya, people live in tribes. And you hear, or they live in villages, and you hear the expression, it takes a village to raise a child. Swaziland live in homesteads. So you might have a man, he might have, polygamy is very common, it's not everyone, but let's say a man has 6 wives. And this has been a traditional living arrangement for many, many, many generations. And it has, historically, it's worked. But then when HIV and AIDS came in, and culture changed, it's disrupting the society. So you have a man, let's say he has 6 wives. And let's say each of those wives has 6 children. each woman has probably given birth 8 or 9 times. But we have a very high infant mortality rate. So maybe 2 have died, maybe 3 have died. So let's say, for example, there's 6 children in each of these homes. The man may go off and find work in South Africa. He goes to a mine. He goes to Botswana. He goes to Namibia. He goes and finds work. And he's gone for a year, because that's how long his contract is. And then he comes back to Swaziland for a month to live with his family. And he goes and visits each of his wives, which is there's nothing wrong with that. But while he's been in South Africa, he's been involved in behavior sexually that he shouldn't have been. And he brings HIV back to the home, but he brings it to all 6 wives. It's not that he's bringing it to one, and then when that wife dies, there are 6 children left. The problem that we're seeing in rural Swaziland is that the man has infected 6 women, and then he might go back to South Africa to work. They never see him again. He's died. And now each woman, one by one, gets sick. And it could be the flu. It could be pneumonia. It could be an ear infection. You know, HIV reduces our immune system so that we get sick from anything. So TB and HIV are best friends. That's another whole lecture I could give. You know, we're struggling with multi-drug resistant TB in Swaziland in a very, very big way. But so now each woman dies, one dies, the next dies, the next dies, the next dies. So from that one man, we now have 36 orphans. 36. And I've gone out into the most rural communities and found as many as 57 children under the age of 15. Swaziland, a country of 1 million people, we have 15,000 orphan-headed households. 15,000 orphan-headed households. So that means the oldest person in the family is 15 years old or younger. There's no adults. It's a crisis. Because how does that 15-year-old